welcome to session two, I guess, of our Hogtown F.O.O.L Back to Basics presentations. They're very short, very sweet. What we decided to do is we're going to have some Canadian content and decide or discuss things that are around the kitchen table that we talk about. So last week, Chad Roberts put on a fantastic presentation on AutoX and the complexities of that and how to size it up. Size up was the big takeaway from that one that I had, and I think majority of people did that too. Tonight, we're going to be talking about smoke reading. Smoke reading is fundamentally one of the most important things we have to do on a 360. We're told again and again and again, do the 360 or size up, but nobody has ever really taught us smoke reading. And smoke reading is going to tell you exactly where you have to initiate your attack or what kind of attack you're going to do, or even if you're going to do an attack, if we have to go defensive and stuff like that. I'm not a fan of defensive, but there are going to be those times you have to make that decision. So smoke reading and understanding what the building's telling us is a big part of that. So anyhow, Steve's put together a very good presentation, very to the point, and we're going to be discussing things as we go, and we'll carry on afterward with the questions, and because it is one of the ones that we seem to neglect. And I'm going to give kudos out to a few of the people. Dave Dodson is definitely one that we've all developed our interpretation of smoke reading, and we've developed our own, I guess, models from when we arrived to an incident. Okay.
Just to introduce myself a bit, I'm a firefighter with an urban department here in Ontario. Been teaching live fire for quite a few years. I've also been actively involved with flashover with our municipality as well. And sort of threw this together because I thought it was sort of education that was lacking, or it was a skill set that was lacking in how we trained and how we looked at fire behavior. It always seems to be what's going on inside, but we obviously start from the outside. So it's a good idea to understand what we can predict as to what's going on, and to understand maybe what we're walking into. And without having a little bit of a primer, I'm not professing to be any sort of expert on this, but I've seen enough fire and enough fire behavior to sort of be able to put the picture together between inside and outside. So hopefully I give you a little bit of a primer tonight so that we can sort of determine. Now I've kind of leaned a little bit on Dave Dodson's work. It's kind of hard to access now without ordering a DVD. So a lot of it, although it's not Canadian content, it is, it should sort of drive home some of the points that we're going to talk about tonight. All right, so like I said before, this is sort of just a primer, just to give everybody an idea or a launching pad in terms of being able to read smoke, to evaluate what's going on, calculate what we're walking into, estimate possibly the intensity or the situation going on, and then act, like choose the right decisions or choose the right tactics in order to proceed forward. So basically, as an overview, we're going to talk about a bit about fire dynamics, just basically the fire triangle, heat release rate. We're going to talk about what smoke is, how it moves, looking at the characteristics of smoke, and not just fire, because fire tells you what's going on, but smoke can also tell us what's going to happen. And the biggest way of doing that is to determine it through the way I break it down to easy to remember is sort of its rate, rhythm, volume, and color. Dodson uses volume, velocity, density, and color, but it's the same idea. We're just trying to quantify what we see. And that way we can start talking about what's happening, how is it changing, what's going to happen next, and what are we going to do about it. Okay. So understanding smoke, you have to sort of have a good basic understanding of fire dynamics itself. So once we understand that the fact that fire is a chemical chain reaction, we know that we need those elements in balance in order to keep that chemical reaction going. So we need to balance oxygen, heat, and fuel. And that basically has a predictable effect on that chain reaction. And smoke conditions, from what we've seen and what we understand about fire behavior, is smoke can actually indicate what element is missing. And once we understand, what stage the fire is in, or once we understand how the smoke actually presents itself, we can actually start to maybe infer as to what phase the fire is in, whether it's incipient, growth, fully developed, or decay. And the smoke conditions that we actually see can indicate the stage of fire that we're in. So the hope is that we can kind of get a basis for interpreting smoke behavior in order to sort of better predict either what's missing or what phase the fire is actually in. Okay. So to understand a bit about fire dynamics, we have to understand about heat release rate, and it's the amount of energy a fire will release over time. And you can see by the graph there that the heat release rate increases as the fire develops. It's one of the better predictors of fire growth. It also helps us predict the fire spread and the potential of the fire hazard itself. It's heavily influenced by the fuel load. Some fuels obviously absorb heat a lot easier. Think of your polys, your VCRs, or DVD players, iPads, this laptop that's not working properly. All that kind of stuff readily absorbs heat, and it absorbs heat and releases that flammable fuel mixture a lot sooner than some of the legacy fuels that people have encountered 20 years ago, like the leathers and the woods and the cottons, the wools, that kind of stuff. It takes a lot more heat energy in order for it to break down and release that energy. So that's how it's influenced by the fuel type. Building construction, obviously newer construction will affect how heat is absorbed and released just based on some of the new materials that are involved, some of the new paints, coverings, carpeting, all that kind of stuff has some sort of polymethyl stuff mixed into it that readily absorbs heat, breaks down very easily, and it speeds up that development, the fire development. And the stage of fire, the more advanced the stage of fire, the greater amount of heat. Going back to that, the chemical reaction that we talked about, or that I breezed over earlier. As that chemical reaction speeds up, as a stage of fire speeds up, that chemical reaction speeds up. And then ventilation is obviously going to play a role as well. So, the less oxygen kind of throws the balance of that chemical reaction off, and it'll slow the heat release rate down. So understanding where we are in the fire development stage will, through size up, will give us a better indication of what's going on inside. So that's why size up and monitoring smoke, not just what we see when we show up, but how it changes as we're catching a hydrant or as we open that front door. We want to see what those changes, how they present, and what kind of information that's actually giving us. So it's paramount to understand the changes as well. So when we talk about smoke, obviously we want to know what it is. So smoke is a result of pyrolysis. It's basically just the breakdown of material from heat. So as a material is heated up, breaks down first into a flammable vapor, and then that's what ignites. So it can only absorb a finite amount of heat before it starts to break down. And that's where I was getting into earlier about the materials. Some of the materials readily absorb heat, so they're more readily pyrolyzed than others. But as it breaks down, it creates more and more of that flammable mixture. And then when it starts accumulating in an environment, we start getting that collection of unburned solids, liquids, and gases. And that sort of reinforces the fact that smoke is fuel. I mean, we've seen that, we've heard that. But it's basically, unless there's enough heat to completely combust it, it's just going to break down, or oxygen in order for combustion. It's going to keep breaking down and accumulating until it finds the right balance to ignite. But as it develops within a compartment, it starts developing its own rate, rhythm, volume, and color, and that's what we should be evaluating through reading smoke. And that rate, rhythm, volume, and color is, what they talk about, the volume, velocity, density, and color. And that's sort of what we're going to try to zero in on. So it's one thing to understand sort of how a fire develops. And I think everybody in this group has a good understanding of fire dynamics. And we probably have a pretty easy time with how smoke moves. Basically, something starts breaking down in the presence of heat. It starts mushrooming up and out, but it's always seeking the path of least resistance. So you consider, the size and the space of the area, natural openings, that kind of stuff. And it's definitely influenced by compartment size. So one of the things to take into consideration is when we start seeing signs of smoke, we have to put it in the context of, are we looking at a 10 by 10 garden shed, or are we looking at a Home Depot? And the similar smoke signs will obviously give you completely different information and completely different predictable cues as to what's actually going on inside. So the compartment size definitely has a factor that's involved. And you also have to think that the amount of volume it requires in order to fill that space with smoke and start involving other spaces, the compartment size definitely kind of plays into it. The amount of heat. So as material breaks down and starts heating up and starts burning, and it starts involving more material close by and starts radiating out, the amount of heat is obviously going to influence how smoke spreads out. The amount of pressure that's being built, pushing that smoke further and further away from the point of origin, is obviously where that velocity sort of comes into. And then we're influenced by flow paths. And I think everybody understands the basics of flow paths, but just as a quick review, there's two main types. There's unidirectional and bidirectional. So unidirectional, the easiest way to remember it is it's one way. So you have inlet in one area and exhaust in another. And the combustion source is somewhere in the middle. Whereas bidirectional, you have fresh air and superheated gases sort of competing for the same space. So understanding, the number of openings and the amount of or the capability of smoke to move via these flow paths. And then obviously understanding the effects of wind. So a flow path fighting against wind is obviously going to affect how we kind of predict, or what the signs are that we see outside. So it's something to keep in mind. So as we look at this, you'll see there's more and more elements to it than just looking at the color or the velocity. It's a whole bunch of things in a big picture. So when we start breaking it down into the rate, rhythm, volume, and color, we look at the different elements and how they play and interplay. So velocity, for instance. So the stage of fire influences the heat release rate. So the easiest way to think about this is, the more further advanced the fire is, the greater the amount of heat being generated is, because all the material has that finite absorption capability, and it starts off gassing and it starts releasing heat as it burns, and it provides that combustion feedback loop. So stuff heats up, off gases, starts to burn, adjoining stuff heats up, off gases, starts to burn. That heat starts building, which increases the speed at which this happens. So that's that positive feedback loop. And then the pressure increases as well. And the pressure will increase and mushroom out until it finds a natural opening, until it finds a way out. It's looking for the path of least resistance. So you can obviously expect that the closer you are to the seat of the fire, the more pressure there is, which increases the velocity. So it's just that increase of pressure due to that heat release rate is increasing the velocity. So you can take a look even in that picture on the right. You can see that there's some pretty black smoke coming out of the third-story window and not much else. And then there's some lighter smoke on the left side of the picture. And even though it's a still picture, you can kind of infer that the velocity on the right is a little bit higher than the velocity on the left, which would maybe indicate that the origin of fire is probably closer to that window. But then again, when we look at velocity, we have to consider the compartment size and the number and the size of openings. If it's a vacant building with no windows, obviously it's going to take a lot longer for a great deal of pressure to build up versus a Home Depot with a huge volume. Same thing. It's going to take a long time for that pressure to build up. And like I said before, the wind is going to influence it as well. If it's really windy out, it may kind of give you some false readings as to, what we're actually seeing and what the smoke is actually doing. So we have to take that in consideration. So velocity is one part of it. So once you start seeing velocity, it's due to that pressure, right? It's the speed coming out of an opening. It's telling you there's lots of pressure there, which indicates there's lots of heat. And then there's, the classic, what they call laminar or turbulent type smoke. If it's laminar, it's fairly uniform. That means it's still developing, right? There's still some absorption going on. There's some heat releasing. There's some materials off gassing, but it's still got quite a balance. It's got enough oxygen, it's got enough heat and plenty of fuel. So that velocity is fairly constant. It's not interfering with itself. Once you start looking at the velocity, you look at similar size openings or similar openings on a particular level. Like if you look at the picture there, you can see that we've got some heavy smoke on the right and a little bit lighter smoke on the left. It's obviously because it's a still, it's hard to tell what the velocity looks like, but you can imagine the amount of pressure that's pushing all that gray and black smoke on the right versus the amount of pressure pushing the stuff on the left. So, it's a bit of an indication. Again, it's a still picture, so it's hard to see. But when you start comparing one side to the other and one area to another, you can see that velocity is kind of giving us an indication of possibly where the seat of the fire is, where the greatest pressure is coming from. And it's kind of given us the idea of what stage that fire is in and the extent of fire development. So if we've got lots of pressure and it's coming out of small openings, then you can pretty much estimate that you're in a fairly developed fire. And again, as I said, you're looking at that picture, you can sort of determine that possibly the seat of the fire is probably closer to the right of the picture than the left. Again, unfortunately, it's a still picture, but it kind of gives you an indication, or at least a launching pad as to, possibly where it is. But that's just using velocity as an indicator, right? So there's still a couple other things we got to keep in mind. So volume and density I kind of put together because it's kind of hard to differentiate between volume and density just on quick brush. So the volume of smoke, I always equate it to how much of an opening it's actually filling up. All right. So density is more how dense, how thick, the visibility that you could anticipate in a closed environment or within the environment inside the building. So obviously a large amount of smoke may indicate either a large fire load or heavy fire involvement. So obviously, like you can kind of guess, looking at large amounts of smoke without looking at velocity doesn't really tell you much. It kind of gives you an indication that possibly there's there's a big fire. Possibly it's heavily involved, but we don't really know unless we look at other factors. But if we start looking at light smoke with the presence of heavy fire, or again slipping back to into velocity, we can indicate more complete combustion, because as things combust, there's less byproducts being given off, because they're being completely consumed by the heat. Go back for a second. And then going back into fuel type, like I said earlier, modern foam furniture versus legacy, for instance, that stuff breaks down at low temperatures, 200-300 degrees, where it could take 500 or 600 degrees before something completely combusts in terms of the legacy stuff, the leathers, the wools, the heavy timber, that kind of stuff. They just break down at lower heat. They create greater amounts of smoke, and that's where we see the volume from. So you could actually walk into a fire without tons of heat, but based on the amount of smoke alone, that there's really crappy material breaking down at a low temperature. So again, putting the volume, putting the density together with the velocity sort of completes the picture. All right, so once again, we look at compartment size and how it influences the volume. So compare light smoke coming out of a garden shed versus one at Lowe's, right? So using volume and density of smoke in and of itself isn't a good indicator of what's going on inside. We know that as the heat increases and that fire mushrooms out, it's due to the heat spreading up and out and then pushing everything down. And it pushes that neutral plane down as well. So once you start looking at the volume of smoke, you start looking at how much the smoke actually fills up those natural openings, the front doors, the windows, that kind of stuff. In your typical 2-story residential house, if the top third of the door is filled with smoke, you can maybe start, by looking at other factors, you can maybe start inferring that possibly the fire is above that level, or it's in its early stages. It hasn't filled up that volume of space yet. But if you start seeing smoke banking down, that neutral plane starts dropping down to about halfway through the window, you can probably guess that it's a little bit more advanced, or that you're closer to where the source of the fire is. So it's one thing to keep in mind that as we walk up to a call, as we start looking at the volume of smoke coming out of an opening, if it starts filling that entire opening, you got to start thinking, are we looking at the potential makings of a hostile fire event? Is it below grade? Those are some of the things you should start thinking about. You're putting together the volume of the space, the amount of smoke that's coming out, and the density. So once you start putting that together with the velocity, and then monitoring those changes, seeing how it changes as you apply water or as you make entry, change openings, that kind of stuff. Look at the change in that neutral plane. Use that to your advantage. That'll give you an idea of how to evaluate, what's going on, where it is, calculate the amount of involvement, estimate what you're going to do next, and then go ahead and make an action plan from there. So once we start talking about smoke in and of itself, we can start looking at how smoke looks depending on the type of or depending on the stage of fire itself. So the incipient, basically it's starting out. We got oxygen rich, we've got fuel rich, but not a ton of heat yet. So there's enough heat where it's starting to combust. It's combusting cleanly. There's not a lot of interference. It's not consuming all that oxygen. So the balance is right. The chemical reactions are allowed to occur. It can occur unchecked, basically, until you start getting into that growth where you get more and more pyrolysis mixing in stirring things up, accelerating that heat feedback loop. So that loop that I was talking about earlier, where as stuff heats up, breaks down, creates more heat, which breaks down faster, increases the heat. That's where we start getting that turbulence, right? Once something's fully developed, we've got oxygen, heat, and fuel basically just at the top of its balance. Once we go beyond that, the obvious step is it starts to decay. So the fuel, oxygen, or heat, something is limited. It's starting to decay for a reason. So something's starting to run out. Most cases in most residential homes, apartments, condos, fuel isn't necessarily the issue. It's usually oxygen. Everything's so well sealed now that it becomes lean due to the fact that there's just not enough oxygen available for that combustion to occur. The thing to understand with decay is that it's completely reversible. So if there's still enough heat and enough fuel and all it's missing is oxygen, and we show up, knock the door open, we obviously reverse that process and it goes right back to fully developed. Or worse, we get into a flashover or potentially a backdraft situation. So if you look at that graph at the bottom, you can see at the incipient stage, there's not a ton of heat being released. As the fire develops, the heat release rate goes up exponentially until it gets to fully developed. And then it kind of peaks off. Once it begins to be decayed, the heat starts to drop. And that's because we've slowed that chemical reaction down. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Once we start seeing that smoke color changing, we have to start thinking about what stage of fire it's in, what the velocity, volume, density, the stuff that we've already looked at, what's changed. And maybe we can start inferring, as based on what we know about fire behavior, what stage we're at or what potentially could happen next. And then we start looking at the color. So the color is one of the last things, because it can tell you a little bit about what's going on, but it's not the end all and be all. Like we can see dark smoke, but if we don't start putting it together in the big picture, then it doesn't really tell us much. So if we show up and we see white smoke, unless we start putting it in terms of the size of the box, the stage of fire, the weather, that kind of stuff, we can maybe infer that it's just moisture coming off. It's that steam kind of looking smoke, and we all know what steam looks like. So as materials heat up, obviously the moisture has to come out of it before it'll actually start to burn, and that's what we start seeing. So in the early stages of fire, that's when we see white smoke, the moisture being evaporated. And this is in general. This isn't as a rule. This is just in general. Because running a flashover can, you can have steam coming out at great velocity, and there's still tons of heat in there. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not hot. You just have to put it into context. So we're looking at early stages. You're seeing that white smoke, and then we wanted to kind of infer as to is that volume changing? Is the color changing? Are the smoke conditions changing? And then we got to start thinking, is that a sprinkler going off in there controlling that fire, or, potentially just barely keeping that fire at bay? And, unless we look at the color with the other sort of qualifying factors, then we really don't know what's going on. And that's why, you start asking yourself, is the color getting darker? Because if it started white and starts getting darker, that means that fire is advancing. And is it migrating somewhere else? So like we said, like when you start having that initial incipient phase of fire, you have that moisture burning off. Do you see a little bit further along that building some white smoke coming out where there's dark smoke coming out in a different area? And you start comparing the two and you start thinking, man, is the fire going in that direction? Is that why I'm starting to see white smoke? Is it ventilating in that direction? Is that the natural progression of the smoke moving in that direction? And it's sort of filtered out all those particles. Those are some of the things that you can start considering as we start evaluating the color, right? As a fire develops, the smoke starts changing color, right? We start seeing black smoke. It can be any number of things. It could be a later stage of fire. those polycarbonates, all those polymethyl um, iPads and everything melting, off gassing. And because of that, because there's lots of fuel, there's going to be more heat and pressure. So the smoke color only tells us a little bit. When you start looking at the rate, rhythm, and volume, it'll start indicating, we actually have maybe a fully developed fire going on. Is it getting darker as we're standing there hooking the hydrant up, as we're getting ready to make entry with the nozzle? If it is, then we know that fire is becoming more and more fuel involved. It's starting to really develop. Do we start seeing flames visible in the smoke? That means that it's finding the oxygen that it needs, and it could be just at that opening where there's enough oxygen, but it could be superheated inside. And like I said, is the color the same in other openings? If I look further on down that building, is it still dark smoke way down there? Is it lighter? Is it the window that you see the flames coming out? Is that just the area that's the lowest resistance? Is it the path of least resistance for the smoke to come out? And it's just following that natural flow path. So those are some of the things, again, with the size up, we start looking at. So the smoke gets darker. We know just through fire behavior and fire development that fire is starting to grow and get a little bit more significant. So now we get to the brown kind of crappy type smoke. So once you start seeing that, a lot of the polycarbonates have burned off. Now you're starting to get into wood, cellulose, the organic type stuff. That's the stuff that houses are built on, right? Structural involvement. Is there a collapse potential? If we've seen smoke go from dark black to black and brown, it is getting into the structural members, and it's something that we have to be concerned about. And we want to compare it with other openings. Is it just limited to one area? Is it spreading? Is the color of the smoke the same from one opening to another? And that'll help us prioritize, where are we attacking and where are we defending, and from where are we going to attack? These are all questions that, the color can kind of lead us to, but again, using color in and of itself does not really give us the complete picture. So if you take a look at a picture like this, you can see where the smoke is actually coming from. The majority of it is coming from the attic. That yellowish gray, it's not the greatest picture, but you have to understand that fire gets to a certain point where it needs all of those elements in balance, the fuel, the oxygen, and the heat. And once the oxygen is limited, we have to start thinking about what's happening with all the heat, what's happening with all that product of combustion. And as it burns, as it heats up, it starts pushing out of cracks around windows, doors, and eaves. So if you start seeing smoke wisping out of areas that probably shouldn't, like really tiny areas, there's lots of pressure there. And if that smoke is anything of any significance with a little bit of velocity, it's indicating there's pressure. And with that pressure, we already talked about the amount of heat that would be involved. And so we could be looking at the precursor of a significant fire event, possibly a backdraft or a flashover. It's just missing one element. But like I said, color alone doesn't give the big picture. So we could look at that and think somebody's made a push and they've knocked a fire down. Again, because it's a still picture, it doesn't really give us a full indication of what's happening. So we sort of have to evaluate it using a larger scope when we show up. So we want to start looking for the warning signs so that we can develop our tactics. So flashover being a temperature driven event, you need a fully developed fire. So there's going to be smoke. There's going to be an indication that there's a fire going on. You need high heat, which is going to drive the velocity of that smoke. There's a lot of pressure involved. There's going to be a low neutral plane. So when you start looking at the volume and density, you're going to have lots of smoke, and the neutral plane is going to be down right to the bottom of the opening. Whereas backdraft is more of a pressure driven event. You may not necessarily see tons and tons of smoke, but it'll be pushing out with lots of pressure. And it's going to be puffing because it's increased pressure within the container, and it's leaking out of its path of least resistance, whether it's a crack in the bricks or whether it's around window frames, anywhere that it can squeeze out. But it just doesn't have enough to burn. And the color is obviously going to be different. So because it's missing that element of oxygen, it's going to be a greasy gray, black smoke, and it's going to be coming out of areas where you don't really expect it. In the picture you see here, that sort of post flash, the rooms have flashed. You can see the volume of smoke. You can see that it's pretty much a heat driven event. There's lots of heat, lots of fire there. Luckily, backdraft is a very, very rare occurrence for firefighters, and it's probably based on the fact that some of the I wouldn't say shortcomings, but some of the things that people overlook are putting all those pictures, like the volume, velocity, density, and color, together to evaluate what's going on, so that they can sort of better protect themselves. And so understanding how fire behavior and how a fire develops inside and what it looks outside, and putting the two pictures together kind of gives you that ability to estimate and act as to what's going on. So once we look at this, revisit this picture, we've already talked about it a little bit. You can see that there's some volume of smoke on the I guess it would be the third floor, coming out of the dormers and stuff like that. And you can see there's a lot of stuff going on in this one picture where you can kind of start inferring as to what's going on. So I would estimate that the fire is sort of on the top left, based on the amount of smoke coming out. And it's obviously moving its way to the top right, and it's moving its way to the left. So you have the white smoke, it's starting to develop, and you can see the small window up and to the right of the front door, or the side door there. Yep, right there, Dave, thanks. It's kind of white smoke. There's not a lot of pressure, there's not a lot of volume to it, but it's white. So maybe the fire is starting to spread its way down. One thing to consider is that the color is a multitude. Like there's white smoke, there's black smoke, there's brown smoke. So there's all kinds of stuff going on, right? So we got to take a look at that in as a whole and start estimating, okay, we got a fire, possibly the third floor, spreading, from right to left across the top floor, possible involvement going down into that intermediate level there. Now we have to start thinking, what's going to happen next? Is it going to spread there? Like, do we have the capability going in and putting this fire out? What are our ventilation considerations? Is there a collapse potential? Do we see any indication that potentially we're looking at structural involvement, right? There's some of that brown smoke in there. So that's something to keep in mind. And then where do we go from here? Like, looking at the main floor, we could make entry there. There may not even be smoke until you get to the top of the second floor. So, it's one of those things where you start looking at it. And again, it's a still picture, so you can't necessarily see how things are changing or how things are presenting. But in a brief snapshot like this would be your arrival. You show up, this is what you got. Okay, what am I starting to look at? That rate, rhythm, volume, color, put it all together, use that size up, right? And then that'll give you an indication, or at least a launching point, as to what's going to happen next. So again, just a quick summary. If we understand how fire dynamics contribute to fire behavior and obviously fire development, it'll kind of give us an indication of what we're seeing outside, because it starts giving us a better picture. Once it's like getting the pieces of the puzzle all together, seeing inside and out at the same time. So we kind of understand that smoke moves up and out, and it obviously, the closer it is to the point of combustion, the faster it's going to move, because that's where all the pressure is. So once we start comparing similar size openings, or we start comparing the velocity of smoke in one area versus the other, we can sort of estimate possibly where that smoke, where that fire is, where that point of combustion is. We can even start estimating, okay, what's actually burning in there. We've got black smoke in this particular picture, and we got some white smoke. We got areas of flames visible. You know, we obviously don't want to focus solely on where the flames are, because that's telling you where the fire is. But we can start seeing where the smoke is and the color of it, and we can start maybe determining, oh, well, that's possibly where it's going to start moving. So maybe we should start protecting that area and moving into the area of involvement, if that's part of your tactical consideration. Or where am I best to ventilate in order to protect the rest of the structure, that kind of stuff. So that's sort of the impetus. This is just a launching pad, sort of a primer as to using the volume, velocity, density, color, like I say, the rate, rhythm, volume, color of smoke, sizing it up, figuring out what's going on, so that you know, you have a better idea anyways of how to sort of continue what's going to happen next. And that is it. Thanks, Dave. Thanks, buddy.
No worries. That was fun.
So one thing I found interesting, especially doing the flashover stuff, is anytime the fire was applied, you could actually see the smoke change direction from the contraction of the heat. So if anybody gets a chance to do something like that, pay attention to what's going on outside as well as inside, because it's such a small container. It's pretty interesting to see. You can learn a lot just by standing outside watching. Any comments or questions or whatever, you can either direct them via text or just shoot them right out.
Go ahead and jump on. Anybody wants to chat with Steve or throw something out there, we'll open up the floor at this point and discuss.
I'll ask a question if that's okay.
Yeah.
What about distance traveled? Like the, you know, I'm not a smoke reader, but the farther the smoke travels, how the color changes and the distance on which it.
I only got part of your question, but you're asking about the changes in smoke as it travels over a distance, right? So you got to think it's going to cool as it gets further away from the source. And a lot of those heavy materials that would otherwise be suspended by the heat are going to start precipitating out. They're going to start accumulating on cooler surfaces like walls, ceilings. So you'll see all that soot and stuff develop further away from the fire. Down, like just think of the soot you see in a hallway of a apartment building on the fire floor versus the amount of damage and the amount of heat involved stuff that you see within the apartment itself. It's the same sort of thing. So yeah, that's why I want to reiterate the fact that color isn't going to tell you everything. And if you start seeing white smoke coming in an area where there's distant from an area where there's black smoke coming out, then that's something to be concerned about, because that as that smoke carries, it's products of combustion, and as the heat spreads, those products of combustion start to accelerate the entire combustion process. So, you know, you got to consider, just because you see white smoke, that's not the whole picture. That's only a part of it. You got to think, okay, you know, here we are. I'm looking at the second floor bedroom of a row house. You know, the adjacent house now starts having white smoke coming out. Well, you know, that's potential. That has nothing to do with the fact that it's maybe a light fire. It could just be that it's spreading in that direction, right? Does that answer your question? Kind of.
Absolutely, that was great. And maybe one more question: when would you hit smoke with water?
You know, nobody's ever drowned in a fire. So if you see smoke, hit it, see what happens, right? Just like you teach in fire attack or flashover. You know, you want to look, listen, and feel. Hit that smoke, see if there's a lot of heavy stuff going over top of your head, because like smoke is products of combustion. If there's heat associated with that and you don't address it as you advance forward, you may end up getting yourself into a situation that you may not be able to come out of. You may have to bail out of, right? So I don't think there's a wrong answer. Hitting smoke is not a problem at all. If you're concerned about water damage, well, that's what That's what insurance companies are for.
Awesome, Matt. That's great. You answered my question.
Quickest answer, Brent, is that if we hit the smoke, we're lowering it from its point of combustion. We're just lowering the temperature, right? So that's the quickest answer, or the way to think about it anyways.
Old tenant was, you worked your way like hard to get to that seat of that fire. New tenant is, or what our understanding of how it works is, as I put water on that, cooling, contraction is our most important thing about that water. What we're using is and it's an old tenant as well as a new, what they want to call new fire attack, but it isn't new. As I put water on that, I'm going to be able, it's indirect attack, until I can find myself at that seat of the fire and then take care of the actual combustion or the actual contents fire. So that's the way that we're going to proceed, hopefully from now on with the fire service. And smoke, again, as I make entry into that building, is going to determine how much I'm going to have to cause the contraction, I guess, or that indirect attack. Okay, does that bring it in line, Brent? Okay,
Beautiful.
Steve, we have a question in the chat from Jordan. Jordan Ellis says, have you experienced smoke changing before from the outside, like from black to white? Does that make sense?
Have I experienced smoke changing before from the outside, like black to white? It usually goes the other way, right? Because when we get there, it's usually not fuel limited. It's becomes vent limited or whatever. But most of the experiences that I've had, it's been white to black. There's been lighter smoke, and then it keeps developing as we're getting lines set up and getting ready for entry. So I'm not sure if that really answers the question or not.
Just the only time that I've ever seen it go like the other way is it's when we start walking into something and you see the stuff starting to get the vapor off. All right, and as you know, Steve, as we go into the flashover chamber, it's one of the things that we like to point out to our students is that the actual materials, every material has some vapor in it. So I'm not going to, again, it's kind of the same way that you were saying, Steve. It's the opposite. We walk in, it gets heated, vapor starts to develop, and that's the first sign that we see that it's starting to off gas. And that's a good sign for us. That means, you know what? It's just vapor or water coming off that. It's when that white starts to turn that we got to have that indication that the material itself is actually starting to release the materials that are going to burn, all right, the fuel. And that's the only time. And the other side of it, when I get in there and I I come on the scene and I see that dark smoke turn to white, that means that my crews have got water on it. And that again, if you guys play with the attack ventilation crew coordination thing, if I get my water on the fire, then I'm going to be able to ventilate. And then that's that key point where I turn a fire to my favor. All right. That good?
Good. Yep. And that brings up a good point, Mike, because you always want to obviously monitor what's changing. If you do anything to a fire, whether it's hit with water, cut a hole in a roof, you want to see the change. You want to monitor that change to make sure it's moving in the direction you want it to. And again, smoke is going to give you that indication. If smoke starts billowing even greater, then you've gone in the wrong direction. If the volume and the velocity start diminishing, then you know whatever you're doing is right, and you keep continuing in that direction. So
Excellent. Chad Roberts from last week, our presenter last week's here with us tonight. Yeah. Thanks for coming out, Chad. Excellent question he has there for you, Steve. Talking about cold weather and how it the relationship with everything we've talked about so far tonight.
Yeah, so obviously cold weather causes things to condense quicker. So you might see that white smoke coming out of a building where it may not necessarily be an indication of what's actually going on inside. So you may be mistaken as to think that, well, it's still in early stages, but because it's so cold out, all that material is condensing, like all that water is condensing. It's just like when we breathe outside in the cold, we see that vapor, exactly the same thing, right? So that's one thing to consider, is that not only color is our indicator, but we want to use everything together. But the one thing I didn't really touch on, and that's a good thing that Chad brought up, is that I didn't really talk about weather. I sort of touched on wind, but yeah, cold weather definitely changes the color as well.
Another question, if you don't mind, what about the thermal imaging camera behavior? Is there a difference with the smokes?
Well, yeah, I mean, with smoke density for sure. If you're into a really heavy polycarbonate fire or something like that, you may actually just be reading not surface temperatures like you would expect or like we've trained to do, but you might actually be reading smoke temperatures, which may be considerably cooler because it may be masking what's going on behind it. But on the same vein, you might actually see the flow path in the camera as well, depending on the amount of involvement in the compartment that you're in. So you may actually see the direction of the smoke, and it's actually leading you towards where the actual fire is, or where the point of combustion is. So, again, it's not like a one fits all answer. You kind of have to put it all together. Like if you're in really heavy, dense, sooty smoke, you may not actually, the camera might not be your best tool. You might have to just use a flashlight or something. Is that the answer? Does that sort of touch on what you're talking about? Thanks.
That's a good point, Steve. You mentioned the flashlight. I teach it a lot, and you do too, and I think most of our crew does. Is if you get into a smoky situation, your thermal imaging camera isn't doing what you think it was going to do. Use your light. Your light's going to tell you a lot. Remember that fire has to breathe. So if you use your light appropriately, you'll be able to see the intake and actually see where the air is going to, and you'll find the seat of the fire a little bit easier than, because our PPE now is eliminating that feeling that we used to have with our ears and our hands and all that we used to use. So the light is a good tool too. So don't ever forget to take a hand light in there and use it. All right.
There's another question in there that like Mark jumped in as well, but from the fellows out west from Lions Bay Volunteer Fire Department. Welcome.
Nice.
Thanks for joining us. I don't know if you see that question, Steve, if you want to have a look at
about
that.
the time. Yeah, I don't actually know the specific timings about vent limited.
We actually have some, sorry, Steve, but we do actually have some from our flashover cans. Again, it's a very small, but we do have great graphs. And I'll put that on later when I do put this recording together. We do a lot to show our students how a vent limited environment can actually take off very rapidly. And we actually have the graphs to match the actual die down as we shut the door. And then actually, once we open the doors, and you've been there, Steve, we've actually been very impressive on how quickly we can change the environment, just the door close and then the door opening. All right.
No, I've heard it could take 10 to 15 seconds for it to actually start developing too. But it, again, like Mike says, it all depends on the volume of space we're dealing with, right? Like the reaction is going to be quicker in a flashover can or a 10 by 10 container than it will be in a Home Depot. So again, put together everything, the whole picture, and that'll give you an indication, right? Yeah, actually, Craig brings up a good point too, depending on the distance from the opening of the fire. So it does take a while for that fresh air to actually reach the point of combustion. So again, it all has to do with compartment size.
What a fire department can do or can cause when they arrive on scene to something that is almost extinguished. And then the next thing you know, we open the door, and we've seen several videos from all over where crews arrive and they have got their water set. But forced entry becomes their number one goal. They force the door. Next thing you know, you see that fire grow exponentially, and you see them getting pushed back because they don't have their BAs on. they don't have their, they're not ready. And if that's any indicator of what we have to do, and we do teach that to an extent, that when we're doing forced entry classes, make sure you control that door. All right. Yeah, we bust the door open, we won that battle. Next thing you know, we lose the big battle. So vent limited is good for us to a point. All right, and take advantage of it.
One thing I think a lot of people don't realize too, when it comes to vent limited fires, is what happens to the temperature. Everybody expects it to go up, and it's sort of counterintuitive. And we show it, we've graphed it time and time again. The temperature actually goes down, and it's because we've slowed that chemical reaction down. We've actually slowed the combustion process down. But what also happens, because the combustion process, or because the temperature goes down, the combustion process slows, visibility goes down. So if you're using ventilation to limit the amount of fire spread or to control the fire, you have to consider what it's doing to the visibility inside as well. So that's a consideration for primary searches. So it's one thing to think about, like every action has a reaction in terms of the chemical interaction, heat, fire, and or heat, fuel, and oxygen. Once we start manipulating that, we have to understand the reaction that we're going to get out of it.
Mike, for those of us who were in left field a few minutes ago, you stressed some importance about taking the hand light in. Can you just go back just before that to explain the importance of that? I think that was a pretty important thing, and I missed.
So essentially, you're using your light in and about where the neutral plane is. You can actually see the smoke moving in a different direction. So you could be moving in from a door towards the heat source, and the smoke is moving in your direction. You got fresh air at your back. You're using that flow path, a bidirectional flow path, and it's the smoke is actually being driven in the same direction you're crawling. So that means you're actually going towards the fire. So if you shine your flashlight and you see that neutral plane, you can actually see sometimes the direction of the smoke. And that's what sort of Mike was talking about, is that, you know, using your flashlight, watching how the smoke is moving could indicate where the fire is, because it's actually drawing that fresh air into it using that flow path, right? And so that's basically what he was alluding to. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense if I was paying attention. Yes.
I'm seeing we're into now 8:39, so we're just coming over the hour. Which you know what, this is what the intent of these. They're not going to be long sessions. They're about just as you said last week for Chad's, and then this week for this. Is we're here to get you thinking and give you some information that you and we're here also to answer those questions later on. All right, if you have any questions that maybe your crews or yourself later on have, you can always contact us, and we'll maybe play it into another session. So okay, anything else on that?
Hey, Mike, I have one question, and it's just for you older guys that have been on just as long as me, but I haven't really paid attention to fire dynamics and flow paths, mainly for the last 6 to 10 years, more involved. But a lot of the media, I think, information we see on social media and other places always portray that fires are burning hotter than ever, or more hotter than they were before. And I just want to get your guys' feedback on that, because I can
answer that. They're not hotter. They're just reaching their catastrophic state faster because of the release of the heat release rates. The materials that Steve talked about, our materials are releasing the potential for that catastrophic a lot faster. So they aren't hotter because everything kind of gets that burning point, that temperature. But as Steve alluded, we're getting into these polycarbonates and stuff like that, the ethyl bad shit kind of stuff. And what happens is that once it gets a little heat on it, it starts to decompose a lot quicker. And once it decomposes quicker, it's going to start to develop more of that fuel. And then we get into like I like to call it, catastrophic fire event. It's not just backdraft. It's not just flash over. It's all of those all involved, right? So it's not. It's really true that the fires have changed, but it's not. They're not hotter. Okay. A lot of things have changed too in our attack. We used to have a tenet that we vented everything. As we went, we vented. And we thought that that allowed for that smoke and heat and all that to get away from us. But it had another event that it caused was a flow pass where we got caught between the actual fire and the vent location. And I think we're getting a lot better disciplined at that. And so we're actually being more cognizant of, if I open this, then that's going to put somebody else at risk. So we're being a little bit more careful with that. So, and again, that all comes into the fires aren't hotter; they're just getting to that place faster. And one good video out of Governor's Island that I like to use as a training thing is you'll see them. They've got all their diagnostics in the building. They light the fire in the main floor. And you see it starting to do its development. They shut the door. You can see the smoke starting to build and going up to the second floor. And you can see it puffing out the front door because they do leave it ventilated. And then about 4 or 5 minutes into the video, you see it suck it all back. And on arrival is generally about that time, 5-7 minutes is when we arrive. There's nothing visible. So you arrive, and then you can see they punch the door open, and then it does what it needs to do. It wants to get its air, and the catastrophic fire event happens. So these are things that we have to understand, as Steve alluded to, that the buildings now that we're dealing with are so built for saving us money and being more environmental or whatever. That the next thing you know, we're arriving on things that nothing's visible, and we're going to be coming into something that's catastrophic. So we have to keep that in mind too. All right. Get your lines ready before you arrive. All right. All right. So here we got a question from Marcus. Water on smoke. Can you address the benefit of doing so in terms of resetting the fire? Yes, we are proponents.
Like we talked about earlier, if we're hitting the smoke, we're lowering its ignition temperature. We're giving it the contraction that we're basically interrupting that expansion from the heat, and so we're cooling the smoke. We're in effect, like we said, resetting it. So we're knocking it back, giving ourselves a chance to advance rather than advancing underneath it and having it sort of catch us off guard or something inadvertent happening where we're not prepared. So yeah. Water on smoke, again, that contraction, causing that reset, ignition temperature, cooling the surfaces to prevent a negative effect from happening. Does that answer it there, mate?
I think so. What do you think, Marcus? Is that good? Gives a thumbs up, probably. Another one from Jamie. Can you touch on Main Street USA balloon frame construction and smoke flow pass? Don't ever put a positive pressure fan in there until you actually have water to knock that sucker down. All right. You'll see me kicking that fan out of the front door. I think Steve, you'll do the same. And I think more majority of us will. That fan,
yeah.
Especially if I see that brown yellowy smoke, you should not have a fan anywhere near that. Agree?
It's an uncomfortable feeling seeing smoke coming out of the eaves from a basement fire.
Correct.
On a 3-story house. So yeah, I mean, but that's about a bit more about migration and building construction. Again, it's part of your size up, right? But yeah, make sure you have the fire under control first, or at least you know exactly where it is.
100%. And again, just to build on what Steve was saying, from when we arrive, and color isn't that big a deal, but it is a big deal. All right. And once you play all the factors, the volume, the speed, and then I see it's that yellowish brown color, then I have to say, we're into the structure, and then judging from my and talking to like Mark Vanderfeist talks about profiling your running area. If I'm downtown in the beaches area, I'm dealing with balloon construction in the majority of my buildings. So if I have some of that yellow brown smoke coming out, I've got a different plan. I've got to start thinking about how I'm going to be able to find this fire, because through that lath and plaster, all that kind of stuff, we're going to be having to deal with a different kind of attack. Do you agree? I that's my experience anyway, and and we have a lot of balloon construction. We are, and I'm sure the question was asked by Jamie Miller, and I'm sure up in his area in Fergus they have a lot of it too. All right. Anything else from our panel there, Davey?
If you're referring to this, Dave, I have nothing, but Dave Bada has a point he's made in the chat there.
So cooling smoke, more effective to cool smoke with a fog. So the thing you have to consider is how much heat you're dealing with, and to consider you're throwing small droplets of water into a superheated environment, it's going to create steam that much quicker. If you consider burning a 2x4 versus sawdust, what lights off quicker, what absorbs heat and converts quicker? And, you know, using a fog pattern, obviously the conversion to steam is greater, the amount of expansion is greater, versus a straight stream where you have the penetration and you have greater absorption of heat before it actually creates steam, and you don't entrain that much air with a straight stream. So using a fog, we're really, even with the recruits that we deal with now and throughout the flashover training that we've done and a lot of the live fire, we're getting away from even advocating for fog, except for very, very specific reasons. And one of them is for cooling. We do not want to use fog for cooling, because if it's a hot environment, it's going to create steam, it's going to pressurize that area. And from personal experience, steam will push products of combustion through your bunker gear. It's happened to me on a couple of occasions. So it's one thing to consider if you're in a closed environment and it's hot, steam isn't a good cooling option. So just keep that in mind, Dave. Very, very specific applications for fog patterns, and it's being proven more and more through a lot of the studies, even, you know, some of the high-rise studies that guys like Brent Brooks have been doing. You know, they'll be able to tell you just as well as anyone.
Just again, one other thing that the fog pattern, as opposed to the straight stream, hitting the straight stream of the ceiling is going to cause for a cooling effect all across the ceiling and down the walls, but not affect the thermal. And we've proved it several times that if I advance with the straight stream, I'm going to be able to cause that contraction and get to that seat of the fire a little bit more efficiently than if I were to use a fog stream. The fog stream is going to cause a disruption in the thermal and become very uncomfortable, let's just say. And I've felt the uncomfort, and it's not good. Whereas with the smooth bore straight stream in the ceiling, you don't feel that. It's actually, you'll feel the opposite. It seems to contract all that heat, and it all wants to go back to that contents that our ultimate goal is to make that a direct attack. And through my experience, it's always been contraction, and then find a direct attack. And that seems to be the way it works. Anything else? I think we're coming to the end of this, which is exactly what we want to be. I think what we've done with these presentations, and we've given you enough information. We're not, I could give you a whole course on this, and so could Steve, and that's not what our intent was. We wanted just to give you an overview of what smoke reading is, and understanding that when we arrived, it's a very important tool for us to do our 360. And as I said at the start of this, we are been inundated on how a size up is supposed to be better for our, but we've been never told on how to actually do a size up. And smoke reading is probably the 80% biggest part of this size up. So that's why we thought it was important. Steve put this together, and kudos to Steve for this. It was what we needed. And now you can go back to your kitchen tables this week, and hopefully, and again, this is free. We're putting this out for everybody to take back to your stations and or to yourselves and discuss it. And if you have any questions, you can contact any of us, and because that's what Hogtown F.O.O.L is about. We just want to get that information out to you guys. Okay. All right. Anything else from Steve in conclusion?
I know it's probably not the most paramount or the best PowerPoint out there, but if anybody wants it, just contact me, and then I can send it to you for, even if it's just a refresher to go over the information. It's completely okay. We're willing to forward that, and then if anybody has any additions or deletions or anything, let me know. It's a living document. We're just actually delivering it on our department to recruits as well as fire behavior. So it's kind of starting to take off. So yeah, any suggestions, anything, obviously welcome. So, and thanks for your patience, guys, while we sorted out our technical issues. And it's good to see everyone. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Anything else from the Vice President there, kid?
No, that was awesome. I'm glad this is an awesome turnout we had tonight. I like that that we're going to continue to try roll out. We did a kind of a back-to-back weekend, but the minimum monthly sessions like this. Again, for those of you guys and gals that are new to us tonight, just keep in mind this is just a collection of everybody's thoughts and ideas and experiences. It's not the letter of the law. This is not the way Hogtown does it. This is everybody is represented from all walks in this group here tonight, and bring all our own experiences. So stay tuned for a lot of exciting stuff coming this summer. Hopefully we can actually not have to do this much longer, and we can all meet each other and do something hands-on. So stay tuned. The executive, we're trying to work out when we can get our forcible entry day going. We're trying to find a day, as everybody can understand, appreciate. It's hard to pick a day at this point. But we have some great stuff lined up coming up. Thermal camera stuff this in the coming months. Some vent inner search we're kicking around. Hopefully some Auto X stuff again late in the summer. Hands-on stuff. There's a few other things, topics I can't recall.
Decision making by Jeff Tanner will be on the 18th.
That's it. Yep, that's the one.
April 18th will be our next. It'll be Jeff Tanner from London Fire. Will be presenting decision making. It's based on thermal imaging as well, but it's going to be a good program as well. So, and again, I reiterate, thank you, Dave. We will be pursuing our hands-on training very shortly, but it's today, I guess, our COVID count went up again. So
tell your friends, let's get more people out to the table, more people's, more ideas, more experiences.
And hey, this is an open forum for anybody of us. Anybody that wants to have a topic, send it to us, and we're gladly going to put this on. So this is a learning tool for all of us. All right.
Just be careful when you come up with a good idea. You're probably going to be presenting it.
Yes, 100%. That's right. All right. And so with that being said, everybody, any other questions? See, we're good. Good job. Great job. Thanks so much.
Hey, Jordan, are you waving, or you want to say something? Yep. There he is.
No, I was just going to say thanks to the executive and everybody that organized the tins. I just got mine in the mail this week. They look amazing.
Good. Excellent. And
I saw Craig's on the shelf there.
Okay. Did everybody else get their t-shirts and stuff? They should have been there by now too. All right.
Thank you.
Good. All right. And spread the word. Well, I've got to get these t-shirts sold so we can get some money back in the bank.